Commercial aviation advancement throughout the decades brought drastic comfort to the people, changing the way we view the world by enabling us to see other cultures, all in a matter of hours. With its surge in mass adoption, the industry immediately became a hotspot for people who want to instill global fear and panic. In December 1994, a Philippine commercial aircraft would become a test subject for a group of high-profile terrorists, triggering a series of events that would ultimately propel the industry for the better. Philippine Airlines Flight 434 was operated by the 15-year-old Boeing 747-283BM. This aircraft took to the skies for the first time in February 1979, then delivered to Scandinavian Airlines in March 1979 as SADFZ. SAS rebranded the jet as the Canute Viking, serving with multiple airlines thereafter such as Nigeria Airways, Lion Air, and Aerolíneas Argentinas between June 1983 and March 1992. The jet was finally sold to Philippine Airlines on April 1, 1992. PAL Flight 434 was the route designator for a flight that flew from Ninoy Aquino International Airport in Pasay City, Philippines to New Tokyo International Airport in Narita near Tokyo, Japan. It has a scheduled stopover at Mactan Cebu International Airport in Cebu City. December 11, 1994, 3 o'clock a.m. While the rest of the metro city sleeps, 26-year-old Naji Avita Haddad wakes up in room 603 of the Doña Josefa Apartments in Quirino Avenue, Manila. He just started renting the room 3 days ago, making an 80,000 peso deposit in advance and an additional 40,000 pesos paid before even entering the room that day. He then prepares for his travel aboard PAL Flight 434, scheduled to depart at around 5 a.m. Haddad arrived at NAIA Terminal 1 about an hour before the scheduled time. There was a noticeable lack of security, and no luggage scanners were established in the premises. The 747 was designed for international flights, but because it was stopping in Cebu first, it could not be parked in Terminal 1. The flight crew arrived at the airport and found the Boeing 747 parked in a lot with no lights, no mechanics, and no security in sight. This was because the aircraft would not fit into Terminal 4 and thus had to be parked somewhere else before the onboarding procedures could roll. Manning the cockpit for this flight is the crew of Captain Eduardo Reyes, First Officer Jaime Herrera, and Systems Engineer Dexter Comendador. Captain Reyes, 57, was a former Air Force pilot who has been serving Philippine Airlines for the past 9 years. Systems Engineer Dexter Comendador was also a former Air Force pilot, joining the country's flagship carrier in 1992 after a decade-long career in the military. Haddad, on the other hand, passed by the security protocols without much problem and was able to board the plane immediately after clearance. Unfortunately for PAL Flight 434, Naji Avita Haddad is an Islamic terrorist. Naji Avita Haddad was just an alias he used in the hotel registration form, and it would prove to be just one of many. He also calls himself Dr. Paul Vijay, Dr. Adel Sabah, Dr. Richard Smith, Azan Muhammad, Muhammad Ali Baloch, Kamal Ibrahim, and Kuram Khan. He is a master forger, and in his passport is another fake name, Arnaldo Forlani. Arnaldo Forlani, an intentionally misspelled name of Arnaldo Forlani, an Italian legislator who served as Italy's 43rd Prime Minister in the early 80s. His true name is Ramzi Yousef, a Pakistani and a convicted terrorist responsible for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. With his belongings carried multiple materials enough to make his improvised test bomb, a nitroglycerin solution concealed in a contact lens cleaning bottle, two 9-volt batteries inside his dope kit, electrical wires hidden at the heels of his shoes, and an altered Casio digital wristwatch. There were metal detectors on the security premises at the airport, but back then, they were only able to scan a person from head to knee. This was the reason why the wirings on his heels were not detected. Securities also checked his stop kit and had a brief check on the liquid bottle. Having been labeled as a contact lens cleaning solution, the bottle was dismissed as clean. The Casio watch also triggered an alarm, but seeing it was but an ordinary watch, securities let him pass through. Flight 434 left Naiya runway at 5:30 a.m. The initial Manila to Cebu leg of the flight was fairly empty, containing only 43 passengers scattered everywhere in seating. A few minutes after takeoff, Ramzi changed seats and moved to 26K, citing he wants a better view to the stewardess. In most Boeing 747 models, this seat is directly above the center fuel tank. However, in this flight, they were using a slightly different model, the SAS version, in which seat 26K would be positioned 2 rows forward of the fuel tank. This was a critical piece of change that would later prove to be the saving grace of all the crew and passengers aboard this plane. Ramzi Youssef entered the restroom minutes after settling into seat 26K. From there, he would access all his improvised bomb materials and began assembling it inside. It would only take a few minutes to assemble the bomb, but it required skilled handcraft and knowledge of how the improvised system works. He first removed his shoe and then accessed the modified heels, where the wirings are hidden. After that, he opened his stop kit where the nitroglycerin solution and 9-volt battery is placed. After setting up the improvised bomb, he removed his digital wristwatch and set the timer to 4 hours, making it the bomb's trigger for the solution to combust. Within 4 hours was the projected time where the plane would be out in the Pacific Ocean. After completing the bomb, he placed it back on his stop kit and then got back to his seat. When he got back, he quietly slipped out the bomb from his stop kit and placed it on the life jacket pocket below the seat. After sealing it in place, he then moved to C-26L, just 1 row up front where he placed the bomb. This was when flight stewardess Maria de la Cruz, a fairly new stewardess assigned to domestic flights, took notice of the behavior when she was serving him his requested food. This wasn't exactly out of the ordinary, and she left him off the hook after serving him. Flight 434 lands in Mactan Cebu International Airport at exactly 6:50 a.m. Of the 43 initial passengers, 25 off-boarded the plane, including Ramzi Youssef. The cabin crew also left as their substitute crew takes precedence. The plane would then be docked for the next hour, and 256 new passengers would board it, most of which were Japanese people. However, it was reported that due to airport congestion, the scheduled flight was delayed for 38 minutes, another piece of information which would prove to be a critical piece for their survival to impending tragedy. By 8:30 a.m., PAL Flight 434 had 273 passengers and 20 crew members. The final Cebu to Narita leg of the flight would take 4.5 hours to complete. At 8:38 a.m., air traffic controllers cleared Flight 434 for takeoff. "11:43 a.m., just past 2 hours after leaving Cebu Airport. At this time, PAL Flight 434 is flying 10,000 meters above the skies of Minami Daito Island, a coral island situated 360 kilometers east of Naha, Okinawa, Japan. Haruki Ikegami, 24, Japanese industrial sewing machine maker, is returning to Japan from his first business trip in Cebu. He has been on C-26K since boarding from Mactan Cebu Airport when he suddenly heard a buzzing sound. The buzzing sound turned out to be the expiring timer from the Casio watch set by Youssef 4 hours ago. Suddenly, a loud blast was heard. The nitroglycerin bomb that Youssef placed under C-26K exploded, creating a 2-square-foot gaping hole in the cabin floor, leading to the cargo hold. Ikegami was seen calling for help, but died seconds later, his body plunging down and getting stuck to the hole created by the blast. There was a loud bang which woke me up. I could feel the plane expanding from the pressure. I saw smoke and debris falling like powder, said Masaharu Shizuki, one of the passengers seated near the blast area. Steward Fernando Bayo immediately addressed the passengers to refrain from standing and remain calm and seated. A number of passengers within the blast area had been moving away in their seats due to fear. Apart from Ikegami, 10 more people were injured, with the next lethal injury is to passenger Yukihiko Usui, who was seated right behind Ikegami. Both his lower legs suffered deep wound lacerations from debris, causing him to bleed badly. Bayo then immediately lifted him up and moved him to an adjacent seat. He then turned his attention to Ikegami, who he saw was floored and stuck on a gaping hole. When he lifted him up, he saw the horrifying sight of an already dead man, with his lower body severed and nowhere to be found. Using a blanket and oxygen mask, he pretended to administer first-aid measures in an attempt to prevent additional panic from other passengers. He then called his companion stewardess to continue addressing the aide to Ikegami and headed towards the comms to report the situation to the captain. Meanwhile, the aircraft immediately took a hard bank to the right. In the cockpit, First Officer Jaime Herrera lost control of the wheel, but fortunately, the autopilot corrected the banking a few seconds later. After the situation inside the passenger cabin has been reported, Captain Reyes instructed Systems Engineer Comendador to check if the aircraft had sustained any fuselage tearings. After a brief stint inside, the engineer reported back to the cockpit and confirmed that there had been no visible damage to the airplane's skin, and with his hoping that the cabin pressurization system would hold up until they could land safely. At this point in flight, Tokyo Airport is still 2.5 hours away. Captain Reyes was worried that the damage to the plane might be more severe than what they could visibly see, not to mention that there's an urgent need to tend to the injured inside. With this in mind, he decided to make an emergency landing to the nearest airport, the Naha runway situated 74 kilometers to the west. He then instructed his first officer to declare a Mayday call to Naha Airport. The Japanese air traffic controller responded first, but had trouble understanding the relayed communication by the first officer, prompting another American controller to take his place. He also decided to turn off the autopilot, which was turned on the whole flight, in an attempt to manually turn the plane towards Naha. He had to do this, otherwise the plane would continue flying to Tokyo. In his first attempt to turn it off, nothing happened. He proceeds to manually steer, but his aircraft isn't responding. He calls his engineer to check the quick reference handbook, the pilot's Bible to aircraft emergency procedures, for steps on dealing with damaged flight controls. This was when he realized that he had lost control of the plane's elevators and ailerons, possibly damaged by the explosion. The elevators are mechanisms located at the back of the plane, attached to the horizontal stabilizers. They provide control over ascent and descent of the aircraft. The ailerons, on the other hand, are mechanisms attached at the back of each wing. They provide control over left or right maneuvering of the aircraft. Captain Reyes realizes they will be missing Naha Airport since they were slowly flying past it, so he decided to turn the autopilot back on and use engine differential power. He ordered his first officer to disengage auto-throttle and prioritize thrust on the left-wing engines, while reducing power on the right-wing engines. Slowly, the aircraft banked and maneuvered to the right. He also reduced his speed to minimize the turning angle and be able to align the aircraft to the Naha runway, while guided by the air traffic controller. First Officer Herrera recommended dumping fuel to reduce the plane's weight and stress on landing gear and brakes. Agreeing, Captain Reyes ordered his engineer to leak 36 tons of engine fuel in the skies. This caused smoke to trail behind engines from each wing, causing fear into the passengers. I was terrified when the smoke was trailing behind each wing. I thought something must be burning and there would be another explosion, passenger Keisuke Aoki said. It was also during this anxious long waiting time for the plane to land that Keisuke reportedly wrote a will to his son on a piece of paper. As they approached the Naha runway almost an hour later, they were guided by a USAF Learjet which has been with them from the sides for several minutes now. The pilot was tasked for visual checking of the fuselage outside to see any damage, as well as to check if the landing gear would be successfully deployed. Captain Reyes and the rest of the cockpit crew landed the damaged 747 in Naha Airport at 12:45 p.m., 1 hour after the bomb exploded. The aircraft's other 272 passengers and 20 crew members survived. The Boeing 747 would then be docked in Naha Airport, where investigation will finally commence to trace back the events that had transpired and ultimately find the culprit. As the days went by, it became clear to the investigators that hunting down Yusuf would prove to be no easy task. Philippine National Police Deputy Chief Avelino Sonny Razon was tasked as the primary investigator on the case. On top of trying to catch a terrorist bomber, the country's security force was also tasked with preparing for the arrival of Pope John Paul II on January 15, 1995. He claimed that they were already receiving intelligence reports of Middle East terrorists arriving in the country during the late months of 1994, and the plan was to assassinate the Pope. After the New Year celebrations, the city of Manila was placed on red alert on January 6. Evening of January 6, room 603, Ramzi, together with a fellow accomplice, was mixing chemicals to mass-produce his undetectable liquid bomb. The chemical mixture ended up a disaster and started spewing out thick smoke inside the room. Hampered with reduced visibility and the accrete-like smell, they were left with no choice but to leave the room. Roman Mariano, the hotel doorman, happened to pass by and noticed a commotion between the two tenants. He was keen on questioning the two about the smoke inside, but the tenants immediately closed the door and said the smoke was because they were playing with some fireworks. After the Pakistani tenants left him, he felt something was wrong and decided to call the fire department. 500 meters away, Senior Superintendent Aida Fariscal was in her office in Manila Western Police District Station 9 when she got a call about a fire in the Doña Josefa apartments. It was already around 11 o'clock p.m., but the city lights would be enough to see the smoke in the sky. She peeked out the window but didn't see anything. Curious and being observant of the red alert, she sent Patrolman Ariel Fernandez to check. The Manila Bureau of Fire Protection arrived minutes later together with Patrolman Fernandez and decided to investigate. They saw the two Pakistani, Yusuf at the security guard post in the lobby, while his accomplice was at the edge of the stairs in the ground floor. The firemen started questioning the two and they responded, "Don't worry, we were just playing with fireworks." All of them then proceeded to room 603 and shortly investigated the area. When they arrived in the room, they smelled the powder, but it wasn't black and was white with a salt-like appearance. Yusuf and his accomplice directed them to the bedroom, where they immediately said, "Well, nothing happened, nothing burned." The firemen, after being distracted by Yusuf's redirection and sudden pronouncement, then felt nothing was suspicious and declared it a false alarm. They all went home and Patrolman Fernandez went back to WPD precinct. Patrolman Fernandez arrived back in WPD an hour later and said, "Ma'am, don't worry, the fire alarm went off. There was no fire." Still stubborn to investigate, she asked, "So why was there a fire?" To which Patrolman responded, "Ma'am, those Pakistanis in room 603 were playing with firecrackers." Two things further sparked the stubbornness and curiosity of Superintendent Fariscal. One was because New Year celebrations have already receded, and two, the mention of Pakistanis. She said, "I don't believe they were playing with firecrackers. We're going to find ourselves a bomb and some terrorist." Meanwhile, Yusuf distanced himself from the apartments and collectively planned with his accomplice on going back. He deemed it was already dangerous now that it has alerted the authorities. He ordered his accomplice to go back to the hotel room and retrieve his laptop. Armed with stubbornness and vigilance, Superintendent Fariscal went to Doña Josefa apartments, together with Patrolman Fernandez and another officer, Reynaldo Tizon. She told Roman Mariano to act as if they don't know them when they arrived and just walk ahead to the room. Silently making their way to room 603, what stood before her eyes in the room stunned her. General Electric markings, large bundles of industrial-sized cotton balls, a round marble table with loops and loops of electrical wirings. In the corner of the room were large open cardboard boxes, each containing large liquid containers with sulfur, chloric, and other harmful chemicals, labeled with a brand from Germany. To the other side of the room was a cabinet with a mirror, from which lodged at the side frame a picture of the Pope. Inside the mirror cabinet were two Bibles, a hair coloring die, two small and one large rosary, the same as those normally carried by priests. As they were carefully peeling out the evidence before them, the telephone rang. Officer Fariscal jumped out of fright. She said, "Get out. No one runs, no loud noises. Let's just go." In an interview years later, she said she did this as she remembered the Sylvester Stallone movie The Specialist, where they picked up the phone and triggered an explosion that split the building into two. They left room 603 quietly and rode the elevator down. When they got to the ground floor, She instructed Officer Tizon to act as lookout across the street and advised once the two Pakistani tenants returned. Patrolman Fernandez stayed with her as she called her superiors for backup. As she was dialing, Hotel doorman Mariano signaled them about the return of the tenants, and to them stood Yusef's accomplice tracing back his steps to their room. Patrolman Fernandez stopped the man, and they would continually argue until Officer Fariscal stopped them and began reading his rights and arrested the accomplice. Officer Fariscal then made a call to her superiors and was to ask for a needed search warrant. To her surprise, a gunshot was heard. Patrolman Fernandez was firing warning shots to the running accomplice. Both Fernandez and Tizon started chasing him within the streets until another shot from the patrolman distracted the fleeing terrorist and an uprooted tree tripped him. Officer Fariscal would hire a minivan taxi to take the suspect to the Western Police District station, and it would be at this vehicle that the suspect would offer her $2,000 as a bribe so that she would let him go. She turned him down, and the accomplice would then reveal his name was Ahmed Saeed, an Islamic terrorist who is Yusef's childhood friend and a member of Jama'ah Islamiyah. After detaining Ahmed Saeed into WPD jail, police officers on watch grew suspicious after hearing Saeed mumble, "To Satans it must be destroyed, the Pope in America." This again pulled the attention of Officer Fariscal and decided to go back to the apartment. She went back to room 603. She arrived at 2:03 a.m. and waited for the bomb squad. Police units arrived around 4:00 a.m., while the bomb squad and security team including the Presidential Security Group arrived minutes later. The police force took in the multitude of evidence they found in the room. Multiple large containers of highly volatile chemicals, glasswares, several meters of looped electrical wirings, 12 fake passports, several fake government IDs each with different names, chemistry books, bomb manufacturing and alarm trigger manuals, several Casio digital wristwatches of the same model, a completed pipe bomb attached to a Casio wristwatch underneath the sink, and the business card of a certain Mohammed Jamal Khalifa. But with all this evidence, perhaps the most critical piece was the retrieval of Yusef's laptop and 4 pieces of 3.5 diskettes. One file with the name Bujinka in it highly details a 48-hour plan of terror across the Pacific. Meanwhile, Ramzi, realizing Ahmed must have been caught, had fled. He hid elsewhere until he was able to book a flight and then flew back to Pakistan a few days later. Yusef would be involved in another U.S. airliner bombing attempt in Thailand on January 31, enlisting the help of his associate Istaik Parker. The bombing was botched after Parker was reportedly too afraid to check in the suitcases filled with bombs. After the failed attempt, the two would move back to Pakistan on February 2, 1995. Back in Pakistan, Yusef tells Istaik that his name was listed in the Bujinka plot detailed on a laptop he left in the Philippines. Parker realized it was just a matter of time before he was caught. Prior to the Thailand recon, he recalled the recently purchased Newsweek magazine. In this copy, it had an article declaring a $2 million reward for the capture of Ramzi Yusef. With fear of getting caught and the reward money in mind, Parker calls the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad, Pakistan, and tells them he wants to turn in Yusef for the reward money. Istaik Parker then worked secretly with agents of Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence and special agents of the U.S. Diplomatic Security Service for days. On February 7, the group raided room number 16 in the Sukasa guest house in Islamabad, a safe house owned by Osama bin Laden. They found Ramzi Yusef and arrested him, who they later found out was planning to move to Peshawar a few days from now. During the raid, agents also found several Delta and United Airlines flight schedules, as well as bomb components hidden inside children's toys. Istaik Parker was then given the $2 million reward money under the Rewards for Justice program and moved to the U.S. with a provided new identity. As U.S. officials are on the plane back to America with the arrested Yusef, the terrorist made a startling confession to FBI agent Chuck Stern and Secret Service agent Brian Parr, officials who were the only ones with him during the flight. Yusef was under the mistaken impression that anything he says to them is inadmissible to court if there are no notes or recordings taken. He talked with them for 6 hours, while the agent secretly took notes. First admission he made was the World Trade Center bombing, saying he tried to dismantle the support columns of one tower so that it would fall into another. After asking who was funding him, Yusuf said it was from family and friends, but did not disclose who. He also admitted ties with Wali Khan Amin Shah, who fought alongside bin Laden in Afghanistan, and Mohammed Jamal Khalifa, bin Laden's brother-in-law. Also in the confession was their plan to assassinate President Clinton in his visit to Manila last November 1994, from which the Abu Sayyaf was reportedly involved. In this assassination, he made mention of an intermediary man behind the plot who was later revealed as KSM, or Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, his uncle who is still at large and is known as the co-mastermind in all of his plots. Back in Manila, police investigators debunked the information on Yusuf's retrieved laptop. It contained critical information about Bujinka, a Serbo-Croatian term for loud explosion. The Bujinka plot is a carefully detailed plan highlighting 3 phases of terrorism attacks, targeting both the Pope and America. Phase 1 is about Pope John Paul II, where he will be assassinated when he visits the Philippines for the World Youth Day celebration on January 15, 1995. On that day, a suicide bomber will dress as a priest, get as close to the Pope as possible while in his motorcade on the way to San Carlos Seminary in Makati, and then detonate the bomb in front of him. According to details, this assassination was merely to distract the attention of the world. The Room 603 rental would prove to be well planned, as this had a direct street view of the route that the Pope will be taking on his visit. Phase 2 involves at least 5 operatives listed with codenames: Zayed, Majbos, Maroka, Mirkas, and Obed. The plan highlights these 5 men blowing up 11 US airliners in the Far East almost simultaneously over the Pacific Ocean, using small but strategically placed bombs made of liquid nitroglycerin. This is the same bomb that is being mass manufactured by Yusuf and Murad in their Manila apartment, and these bombs will blow off as the world is supposedly reeling from the death of the Pope. Obed, who was Abdul Hakim Murad, was to bomb a Singapore-Hong Kong-Los Angeles flight and another United Los Angeles-Hong Kong-Singapore flight, then offboard in Singapore. This flight will become a Singapore-Hong Kong-San Francisco flight. After offboarding from Singapore, Obed was to recon back to Karachi, Pakistan. Mirkas was to bomb United Airlines Manila-Seoul-San Francisco flight, offboard in Seoul, proceed to a Delta Airlines Seoul-Taipei-Bangkok flight, then offboard in Taipei. After offboarding Taipei, he would recon back to Karachi. Maroka was to bomb Northwest Airlines Manila-Tokyo-Chicago flight, offboard in Tokyo, proceed to Northwest Tokyo-Hong Kong-New York flight, then offboard in Hong Kong. After offboarding in Hong Kong, he would recon back to Karachi. Majbos was to bomb a United Airlines Taipei-Tokyo-Los Angeles flight, offboard in Tokyo, proceed to United Tokyo-Hong Kong-New York flight, then offboard in Hong Kong. After offboarding in Hong Kong, he would recon back to Karachi. Zayed, who was thought to be Yusuf, was to bomb a United Airlines Taipei-Tokyo-Los Angeles flight, offboard in Tokyo, proceed to United Tokyo-Hong Kong-New York flight, then offboard in Hong Kong. After offboarding in Hong Kong, he would recon back to Karachi, Pakistan, and meet with the rest of the operatives. The first bombing was scheduled to happen on January 21, 1995. Phase 3 mainly involved Abdul Hakim Murad, flying a plane directly to the CIA headquarters in Fairfax County, Virginia. He would either rent, buy, or hijack a small Cessna plane, fill it with explosives, and fly it directly to the building. The alternative plan, had it been difficult to acquire small aircraft, would be to hijack another commercial airliner, control the cockpit, and fly it directly to the headquarters. Based on the description in Phase 1 of the Bujinka plot, U.S. investigators said the bomb was a Mark II PETN microbomb, constructed using an altered Casio digital watch containing a silicon-controlled rectifier as a switch to trigger the light bulb filaments, an undetectable quantity of nitroglycerin, 2 9-volt batteries as a power source connected to the light bulb filaments. Mark II PETN was supposedly just a test bomb, and it only uses 1/10 of the explosive power in comparison to the bomb he was supposed to use on the succeeding 11 US airliners. The bomb was, or at least all of its components, designed to slip through airport security checks undetected. The explosive used was liquid nitroglycerin, which was disguised as a bottle of contact lens fluid. Other ingredients included glycerin, nitrate, sulfuric acid, and minute concentrations of nitrobenzene, silver azide, and liquid acetone. In an interrogation with a Pakistani official in July 1995, Abdul Hakim Murad said that even if the liquid nitroglycerin is put in the X-ray, you will never detect it, a claim that has been proven true by several U.S. airplane security experts. Even newer screening devices that can see through clothes would have difficulty detecting such substances, experts added. The stabilizer for the nitroglycerin looked like cotton, and Murad told interrogators that nobody can think that it's explosive. Murad also added that to test its potency, they detonated one of these test bombs inside a mall in Cebu City in November 1994, and another one underneath a seat inside the Greenbelt movie theater in Manila on December 1, 10 days before the Flight 434 bombing. Both incidents injured several patrons, but fortunately, no one died. The Bojinka plot would be recognized as a front-runner of the attacks leading to the World Trade Center attack in September 2001. In the days following the tragedy, investigators from the Okinawa Forensics recovered 94 debris fragments on Ikegami's buttocks caused by the explosion. One forensics investigator eventually pieced together components of a burned Casio digital wristwatch, providing insights on what was used as the bomb's timer. When Philippine forensics investigators found evidence in room 603, among them included several Casio digital watches of the same model, tying evidence of the watch being used as the bomb's timer. Investigators also found out that the 9-volt batteries used in the bomb was only sold in the Philippines, giving insights that the terrorist may have been based in the country and could have been there for an ample amount of time already. This has been proven when tracing back travel logs and records. In the latter part of June 1994, Yusuf left Iran after arranging the bombing of the Shiite shrine in Mashhad. He went to the Philippines and trained members of Abu Sayyaf in the use of explosives. At the time, Osama bin Laden was financing Abu Sayyaf, and through the group it is believed that bin Laden had requested that Yusuf assassinate the US President Bill Clinton during a trip to the Philippines in November 1994. The plot proved too difficult for Yusuf and was botched, to which they turned their direction to the scheduled papal visit. The investigation points to three main factors why the plane was able to survive the explosion. 1. The SAS model used in this flight has a modified seating configuration rather than the standard 747 layout. In this model, C-26K is positioned 2 rows of the center fuel tank, thereby preventing direct blast to the fuel tank and avoiding a major explosion. 2. The bomb's orientation, positioned front to back and upward angled from horizontal, caused the blast to expand vertically and lengthwise. This configuration meant that the plane's outer structure was spared, and Ikegami's body absorbed most of the blast force, with its dismembered lower half falling into the cargo hold. It was also the reason why passengers in front and at the back seats of Ikegami were the ones who suffered the rest of the impact. In an interview, Masaharu Mochizuki said, "If the explosion had been sideways, it would have blown a hole on the plane and caused an air pressure problem." And 3. The 38-minute delay in Cebu Airport meant the aircraft was not as far out to the open sea as anticipated, which contributed to the captain's options available for an emergency landing. They also concluded that the sudden expansion of the aircraft cabin severed the steel cables, which controlled the rudder and elevator, as well as the first officer's control cable to the right aileron. This was the reason why the crew was not able to manually drive the flight controls during the aerial crisis. As for the arrested Abdul Hakim Murad, he was allegedly subjected to a battery of torture tests. According to his lawyer, he has been subjected to sleep and food deprivation, electric shocks, force feeding, waterboarded, getting pummeled by chairs and lumber, and testicles incinerated with burning cigarettes. 2 months of interrogation went by with no success, until interrogation was turned over to Colonel Rodolfo Mendoza of the PNP, who used 2 illicit methods to gain information. One was food seduction, saying he could only eat after he provided information. 2. Conferring on him a threat that he will be handed over to the Mossad, the chief intelligence and secret service agency in Israel, if he does not provide any information. The 2 methods proved to be successful. Colonel Mendoza was able to gain information about the post-Bojinka wave of attacks, or a second wave emergence. It was a plan to hijack commercial airliners after the effects of the Bojinka plot had died down. Included on the target were the following buildings: the Pentagon, an undisclosed nuclear power plant, Transamerica Tower in San Francisco, Sears Tower in Chicago, another attack at World Trade Center, John Hancock Tower in Boston, the U.S. Congress, and the White House. Murad would reveal further information about their connections and planned attacks until he was handed to the FBI on April 12, 1995. Colonel Mendoza would then plot a diagram of the connections between the terrorists and hand over the information to the FBI. Murad was eventually convicted on September 5, 1996 of 7 counts of conspiring and attempting to bomb 12 commercial aircrafts. 2 years later, on May 16, 1998, he received a life sentence in prison. To this day, he is still serving his time in the United States Penitentiary Terre Haute, a high-security United States federal prison for male inmates in Terre Haute, Indiana. After news of Yusef's arrest reached the Philippine officials, investigators discovered a letter file on Yusef's laptop signed by Khalid Sheikh. They discovered that KSM had frequently visited Yusef's apartment in Manila during the first half of 1994. This evidence colluded well with the idea from the 9-volt battery, saying Yusef may have been in the Philippines for quite some time already. There's also an entry in Yusef's phone directory for a certain Zahid Sheikh Mohammed, his uncle and KSM's brother. This fortified their claimed connection between the three and made the U.S. intelligence label him as top priority after his identified role in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. On September 5, 1996, Yusef, together with co-defendants Abdul Hakim Murad and Iyad Ismail, who was caught in Jordan in August 1995, were convicted for their role in the World Trade Center bombing in 1993 and the Bojinka plot. They were tried in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole by Judge Kevin Duffy. On November 12, 1997, Yusef was judged guilty as mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and on January 8, 1998, Judge Duffy handed Yusef guilty of plotting a serious conspiracy to bomb the World Trade Center. He sentenced Yusef to 240 years in prison for the 2 bombings and recommended his entire sentence be served while in solitary confinement. In an excerpt from one of the court hearings, Yusef said, "You keep talking also about collective punishment and killing innocent people to force governments to change their policies. You call this terrorism when someone would kill innocent people or civilians in order to force the government to change its policies. Well, when you were the first one who invented this terrorism. You were the first one who killed innocent people, and you were the first one who introduced this type of terrorism to the history of mankind when you dropped an atomic bomb which killed tens of thousands of women and children in Japan, and when you killed over 100,000 people, most of them civilians, in Tokyo with fire bombings. You killed them by burning them to death. And you killed civilians in Vietnam with chemicals as with the so-called Orange Agent. You killed civilians and innocent people, not soldiers, innocent people every single war you went. You went to wars more than any other country in this century, and then you have the nerve to talk about killing innocent people. And now you have invented new ways to kill innocent people. You have so-called economic embargo which kills nobody other than children and elderly people, in which other than Iraq you have been placing the economic embargo in Cuba and other countries for over 35 years. The government in its summations and opening statements said that I was a terrorist. Yes, I am a terrorist and I am proud of it, and I support terrorism so long as it was against the United States government and against Israel, because you are more than terrorists. You are the one who invented terrorism and using it every day. You are liars, butchers, and hypocrites." Yusef is currently serving his life imprisonment sentence in United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, an American federal maximum security prison in Fremont County near Florence, Colorado. Later investigation would provide insights to his actual true name, Abdul Basit Mahmoud Abdul Karim. President Fidel Ramos praised the flight deck and cabin crew members for their professional handling of a potentially dangerous scenario. After the incident, Captain Ed Reyes continued to work as an administrative check pilot, flying instructor, and DC-9 captain for Cebu Pacific until he retired in 2002 after more than 30 years in the airline industry. He also worked as the secretary to the board of directors and as the director of Airlink International Aviation School. He passed away in February 2007 after his battle with prostate cancer. First Officer Jaime Herrera was later promoted to captain and continued to serve Philippine Airlines until his retirement in 2008. He passed away on March 27, 2021 due to natural causes. Meanwhile, Systems engineer Dexter Comendador continued to serve Philippine Airlines until 1998, then moved to Cebu Pacific Air, Vietnam Airlines, and Philippine Air Asia, where he has been serving as the current CEO and president, a position he's been holding since July 2016. He also piloted the inaugural flight of Air Asia to Osaka in July 2019. Philippine Airlines continues to operate Flight 434 between Cebu and Narita. However, it is now a Cebu-Narita sector that is served by an Airbus A321 or an Airbus A330-300 aircraft. In September 2014, the airline announced the retirement of its final 747 aircraft. PAL continues to run a separate Manila-Tokyo route as well. Enhancements to airport security protocols were introduced throughout the years following the tragedy. Despite vying for these protocols to be implemented globally, it would only be until the events of 9/11, the successor of the Bojinka plot, would governments be forced to implement tighter airport security measures on explosive devices. Liquid ban policy in airports would not be in full effect until after the Heathrow Airport bombing in 2006. Full-body scanners were not available globally until 2010. Despite that, security measures are constantly catching up to the times as the need for advancement in technology arises.